and thanks for tuning in to a new episode of Beyond the Noise. It's been 4 months since the first coronavirus case was declared in Africa, in Egypt. 4 months, but who's counting? Since the beginning of the pandemic and since it made its way on the African continent and lockdown measures ensued, guess what has dramatically changed? Education. With the closure of hundreds of schools across all 54 nations, an estimated 297 million students have been affected. And let's be honest, education in many African countries was already faced with structural challenges way before COVID-19. Africa's largest economy, Nigeria, with its population of over 200 million, is a country where education gaps and inequalities are quite glaring. As UNICEF points out, even though primary education is officially free and compulsory, about 10.5 million of the country's children aged 5 to 14 years old are not in school. In the predominantly rural north of the country, the situation is even bleaker. And as nations like Kenya are planning to reopen schools while reducing the classroom's capacities to 15 to 20 students, admitting the need for more inclusive, effective, and innovative education sectors is more pressing than ever. This week, we talked to the founders of two education-focused platforms based in Ghana about the challenges and opportunities they have observed. Phil Playwan of Imano shared his perspective on education and explained why blended learning seems most appropriate in the African context.
Well, all the talk about e-learning is the future and all of that, I feel like, we're very far from that, as a continent. Most importantly, we have to start with blended learning, which is, just a mix of the classroom and e-learning, which is the sort of support that we offer. Let's say, for example, you have kids going to school 5 days a week. If you can reduce that to 4 days a week or 3 days a week, the other 2 days is spent virtually, doing stuff that they can do online, that could, save a household a lot of, money in terms of transportation, all the logistics that comes with sending kids to school. All of these conversations being talked about as championing e-learning as the future. This conversation is only as big as it is now because of, obviously, COVID-19. Closure of universities and schools, that was a decision that the institutions came to learn about like 2 days to closure. There was no time to say, let's put this together, let's get ready so that we can, roll out some sort of support system. But generally speaking, there is a great deal of opportunities in the space. Prior to COVID-19, we had about 4 universities that had on waiting lists to be onboarded to our platform. But now we have about 11. And these are requests from institutions that we've had zero contact with. But when it comes down to it, in terms of households and things like that, those are things that I think government has a big role to play because they set the tone for the education system. There has to be some sort of initiative or a system where access to hardware and internet becomes affordable.
Charles Abigmachior of We Go Innovate told us about his drive to make learning a fun, compelling experience for students and the pivotal role of teachers who have displayed tremendous adaptability skills during this crisis.
Not only will I pick up a book and read, but I have options and I have alternatives to learning. Can I create a content? Can I use a syllabus or take a curriculum and turn it to some sort of play or some sort of drama? Why don't we look at STEM curriculums that were using local materials around the environment, like recycled bottles, like vinegar in the kitchen, baking powder, explaining science concepts in a way that gets the children to beam up. We were at the point where we're thinking, what should the future be looking like? And then COVID-19 happened. We had something to offer. In offering that, what we realized also was that the students were home. So when we launched this on TV and on social media, it was the results, like we had so much positive impact. Students were then replicating these experiments and sending it back to us. So teachers would go and drop these videos to their students, and their students would do the experiment, film it, and then give it back to the teachers. The teachers would send it back to us. We tell teachers, we want you to be a guide in the classroom. Not so much about spoon feeding, but be a guide and allow the student to then question or be curious, where you provide the answers to that curiosity. It's a lot of work. And also because you're managing in Ghana, where sometimes you might have 50 kids in a classroom. Most of our teachers usually teach 150. But what I'm seeing also is that because we're very communal people, we have some sort of advantage. So if you're a teacher and you teach in a certain community, it's easy for you to just run around and sort of like engage with each student and go on. And that is a thing, and I don't think that should stop.
On this week's Muted segment, I want to challenge some of the common misconceptions about the continent's education. As you may know it by now, I am a sucker for history. History provides context to current events and enables us to better answer questions like, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where most African curriculums marry the dawn of our history with colonialism and independence, and delve in such depth into the Greek and Roman empires, the French or English revolutions? Now, many researchers have written about those widespread colonized curriculums, which have arguably painted the Western world as this civilized basin of knowledge and perpetual scientific innovation, and reduced Africa to a collection of young nations grappling with endemic poverty, corruption, conflict, and tribalism. In 1972, Guyanese historian Walter Rodney wrote, and I quote, that the colonizers did not introduce education into Africa. They introduced a new set of formal educational institutions, which partly supplemented and partly replaced those which were there before. This is accurate. There were many sanctuaries of knowledge erected long before colonization in Africa, and they didn't only exist in Egypt. The University of Timbuktu, built under the Empire of Mali led by Mansa Musa, was comprised of the masjid or mosques of Sankore, Jingerber, or Sidi Yahya. The Center of Knowledge, built in 1327, did not have a central organization, but rather independent schools where the primary course was Islam. But academic teachings such as mathematics or anatomy were also taught there. According to the UNESCO, up to 25,000 students out of a total city population of 100,000 were enrolled there. So why have we not visited some of the teaching methods that existed in the Empire of Mali, Ghana, or the Dahomey, which is the current Benin? Well, that's actually what Dr. Shika Ezeanya Esiobu has been advocating for years. In 2019, in a book titled Indigenous Knowledge and Education in Africa, the researcher made the case for our education systems to integrate traditional indigenous teachings, where, and I quote, for instance, a great deal of importance and solemnity was attached to the passing on of knowledge from one generation to another. Education in most traditional Black Africa was also not done in isolation. These groups of individuals were taught progressively as they grew in age and maturity, with their education emphasizing both the physical and metaphysical realities. Now, one of the other common misconceptions about education on the African continent is that governments simply do not invest significant resources towards it. I say it's a misconception because when looking at the actual numbers, they're better than you'd expect. According to the African Economic Outlook 2020, African governments spend about 5% of their GDP on education, which is the second highest in any region. Almost half of all African countries are meeting both of the recommended education financing targets set by the United Nations. Now, on the other hand, the report points out that Africa has a 58% efficiency score for primary education and 41% efficiency for secondary education, both more than 20 percentage points lower than the second worst performing region in the world. This essentially means that our education budget is not well spent, or at least not well enough to ensure that students complete their schooling, that schools and teachers are supported in that end, and that the most neglected regions can benefit from it. Okay, so there's a lot to digest on this episode, but I felt that it wouldn't be complete without hearing from a student whose actual academic year has been directly affected by the pandemic. That's why on this week's Pass the Mic, I spoke to Janali Seyebe, a Gabonese university student in China, about her lockdown experience, how she's coping with online classes, and being away from her family and country in these uncertain times.
Hi, Janalis. How are you doing today? Hi, pretty good.
I wanted to speak to you just to inquire a bit more about what it has been like to be an African student in this context. What measures have been put in place to begin with, how it has affected you personally.
I knew that if I caught that virus, I could literally die because I've got asthma. I literally had anxiety attack for like a week. My teacher had to call the managers where I was to tell them to come and, just check on me. Sometimes she literally come and put food on my door and knock and leave. It was funny, but at that point I saw that my school was doing actually everything they could to make sure that I was okay. I got psychologists there for me, calling me, checking on me. I had people actually calling me from my department office and asking me if I needed money.
And I'm sure like a lot of your family members are still back home. How has it been being away from that? And have you felt supported by institutions from your country?
We have been supported by our embassy because they did what they could at that point. I mean, it was really hard. You have some people who did not even hear from their embassy, and our embassy actually communicated with us, even though they were focused on those in Wuhan. I remember I called my dad, and my dad told me that it was not necessary for me to come because he was scared that I'll actually get sick. So he told me, you know what, you stay there until they tell you that you can come. That was a really hard year for me. Seriously. I lost my mom in August, and then the virus.
I'm sorry.
My dad knew that psychologically I was a mess. Having your family actually there, only just talking to you is actually reassuring, because even though they're not there, but you know they care.
The schooling has changed dramatically since the pandemic started. Tell me more about the way that they have adapted to this and how you're finding working from home in your apartment.
I am not a big fan of online classes. You have a lot of classes, and each class has its own platform. It's a little bit messy, but you have to keep up. The teachers are just talking. They're just talking to the Chinese students. You're like, I have a question, sir. I have a question. Some of them they would just send you a contact. Oh, ask this person. She should know.
Did you say that they often just talk to the Chinese students and not foreigners, or did I misunderstand that part?
No, you did not misunderstood that part, because I am the only foreign student in
your program.
my department. Yeah,
Okay.
in my program. Most of the time, I find myself asking the teachers that, this one I did not understood. This one, can you explain me this one?
Right.
And they often tell me, ask this one. Oh, I don't have time. Oh, you should read this. And it's a little bit hard when you're doing the most to understand and you don't. It's frustrating.
I can imagine. How have you found living in China as an African student, as someone who's probably had to learn Chinese from scratch, and in the context of a pandemic where there's even more panic and anxiety about travels and about other communities?
They have their own conception of Black people, who they are. They think they know us. They just, judge you based on what they think they know about us. Sometimes you just need help, or you just want to talk to someone. They already, back up. I can say right now the situation didn't really change. I might say it's a little bit worse, because even in our school, we've been locked down for almost 4 months. When you go pick your parcels and your mail and stuff, these people, even knowing that you've been in lockdown, you are not carrying any viruses. When they see Chinese people enter, they're like, oh, hi. And when they see you enter, they put their mask on.
What's your plan after you graduate?
I would love to continue maybe in China, or I have options. Actually, I have options.
Good.
So I always think, the world is so big. I want to see things. I want to travel, but mostly I'm an African woman, so I want to make a difference in my continent. So.
Well, thank you so much, Annalise, for sharing and for being so candid.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week's Beyond the Noise. Keep the conversation going and tell us what you think about the education system in your country or in the continent as a whole. And write your comments in the comment section below. I'll see you again next week. Until then, stay safe as usual.